Okay, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Will Huber. I'm the Chief Technology Officer at CDI. And today we're here for our session called Simplifying Containers with VMware Tanzu. So in the keynote today, if you attended it, you probably saw that we were talking a lot about modern infrastructure and modern applications and their role in our customers' digital transformation journey. And we talked a lot specifically about VMware and what they're doing in this space with their Tanzu portfolio, and even did some demos with some of their technology like Tanzu inside of vSphere, as well as their control plane product, which is called Tanzu Mission Control, which is a product that allows you to manage Kubernetes infrastructure across multiple clouds, right? And so what we wanted to do in this session is to invite VMware to come and speak about really what Tanzu is and why it's important and how it can help you along that journey to your digital transformation and your application modernization. So Nick, welcome to the Tech Summit. We're so happy to have you here, and go for it, do your thing.
Thanks, Will, really appreciate it, and excited to talk to everybody today about simplifying containers with VMware Tanzu. So before we get started on our container and Kubernetes journey, I thought it was important to kind of level set, why do we as IT professionals exist? And ultimately, it's to support business outcomes. And what does the business care about? And most businesses are here and they exist to make money. So really the business is really focused around increasing revenue. How do I interact with my end consumers to provide them the best possible experience that ultimately drives up revenue? Second, accelerating speed to market. Extremely critical here to making sure that not only are you adapting to your end users' needs, but you're also able to quickly adjust based off of competitive threats or external forces such as what happened with COVID. Third, really around eliminating risk. And eliminating risk is extremely critical because what takes many years for you to build up in terms of reputation can take seconds in terms of a breach or ransomware, which we've seen a lot in the news recently. Fourth, really want to focus on making sure that our applications and our services that we provide to our end users are always available. There's fierce competition out there, as I mentioned. So it's extremely critical that organizations make sure that their applications are always available so that they do not lose end users to another organization. And then finally, really around executing efficiently. It's extremely important to make sure that ultimately your team is working collaboratively and you're able to execute at a rapid pace and efficiently. Now, as I mentioned, we as IT professionals exist to be able to drive business outcomes. And from an IT perspective, it's really focused around the applications. The business is the businesses leverage applications in order to be able to interact with end users and ultimately drive revenue. And the business relies on the product and development teams to be able to translate those business goals and then be able to deliver software into the hands of the end users. And ultimately, the developers rely on the security and operations teams to be able to provide the infrastructure and make sure that the applications are secure to be able to address all of those 5 pillars that I had previously mentioned. But as you can see on the screen here, it all centers around the application, and that's really where our journey starts today. And I think it's an extremely critical point to anchor on here as we talk about why containers and why Kubernetes. Now, we talked about the various personas, but what do developers really care about? As I had mentioned, the developers are really focused on writing that business differentiating software. They really want to be able to translate the requirements and be able to make it into working application code into the hands of end users very quickly. They need the optionality to choose the languages they want to be able to deliver the software that's required for the business. They also need back-end services. Most applications require, whether it be a database, whether it be a message queue, a variety of services that they use to leverage in their business differentiating software. They don't really care about underlying infrastructure. They care about getting the code in the hands of end users. Then we've got the operations team, and operations is near and dear to my heart because that's where I spent the majority of my IT career in. And as an IT professional, as an operations professional, I'm really focused around consistency. I'm the individual that carries a pager in the middle of the night. I don't want to be getting called in the event that there's an issue. So it's extremely important that, hey, if it works, particularly in a lower environment, that it works the same in production. I also worry about the day two operations, whether it be patching my systems, whether it be being able to monitor my systems. There's a variety of things that are extremely important to IT operations to ensure the availability and security of applications. And then finally, the security persona. The security person is there to provide that different perspective in the room, and they're all focused about mitigating risk. They're constantly worried about the attack vectors that are out in the systems. They're constantly working with IT operations and development to ensure that application code is secure, that infrastructure is secure, and they want to ensure compliance. And a lot of their job is making sure that they're mitigating that risk from that business outcome perspective. Now that we've level set on all three of these personas, I think it's important to highlight here that there's a lot of friction between these organizations. A lot of people, a lot of people have seen this, and that's why you see a lot of these silos where operations is sitting there and saying, hey, dev's just throwing another code over the wall, and then dev's pointing saying, hey, my application is not working because networking is not working. It causes a lot of friction because they have competing interests as to what they're driving towards from a business outcome perspective. Now, we've got this really cool technology called Kubernetes, and Kubernetes has is becoming widely adopted as a default standard for running infrastructure. Now, will containers in Kubernetes solve our business outcomes? Again, going back to those 5 pillars. And I think it's important to note here that Kubernetes solves a portion of those business outcomes, but in reality, it's really around an infrastructure abstract. Ultimately, it provides a technology to the developers, the operators, and security team to solve some of those outcomes, but it doesn't solve all of those outcomes, again, around optimizing your pipelines. So let's talk a little bit about what does containers in Kubernetes solve. First and foremost, it's immutable infrastructure. So you're really reducing the snowflakes. Really important. It works in development, it works in staging, it works in production, it works in DR. You need to make sure that that immutable infrastructure is laid down in the same fashion, and you're reducing snowflakes. From an IT operations and just general cost center perspective, it provides dense consolidation. So there's been many studies out there that talk about the benefits of containers. And what they've found is containers can provide anywhere between 30 to 70% additional density. Extremely important for making sure that you're lowering your costs as you move forward with your business. High availability. Extremely important to make sure that if an application goes down, it doesn't need to be a massive event where everybody's on a call or a bridge at 2 o'clock in the morning and they're going and sorting through logs because this one application server is throwing up errors. No, Kubernetes will quickly identify that an application is not functioning, and then it can spin up a new clean version. It's extremely important to be able to do this because as you begin to scale your organization to be able to meet the end user's demands, you want to make sure that you're running lean and efficient. And then I'll touch on a couple of other things here. Repeatability, consistency of deployment. Again, from a developer's perspective, I'm packaging something up as a container. I want to make sure that it's able to run the same way in development as it is in production. And then ultimately, I want to be able to provide independent and rapid scale. So for example, if I'm running a retail company, I may have a cart functionality, I may have a product display page, I may have a search engine. From that perspective, my cart is probably not going to see as much traffic as my search engine or my product display pages. So in order to do this, you want to make sure that you're making best use of infrastructure and you're able to rapidly scale that out. Now, if Kubernetes and containers don't solve all of my business outcomes, how do organizations accelerate their business outcomes? And I think it starts with, it's really kind of 2 steps. And the first step is really defining what does the software development lifecycle look like from a containerization perspective. As I mentioned, the business cares about the applications and they rely on the developers. So it all starts with an idea and a design. It's then brought to the developers, and the developers are the ones that are writing that business differentiating software. They interact with their IDEs, the CI pipelines, they're building microservices, which I'll talk about in the next slide here. Data pipelines are interacting with data and pulling data from here and there and making sure you're providing the best possible end user experience. they're focused on those tools. Once a developer then checks in code, oftentimes a CI system takes over. And that CI system, probably the most popular is Jenkins. There's also other ones out there, such as Concourse and Bamboo. But ultimately, that CI system takes over. And then what happens is you need to package a container. And this is extremely critical in the lifecycle because it's got to be a repeatable process. It's got to be an agile process to be able to respond to threats very rapidly. For example, last year alone, there were 12,000 CVEs. What we find in a lot of organizations is they're spending a significant amount of time on this small component here, which is keeping up to date, auditing what CVEs are out there, integrating the patches into their systems, and then working with their developers to be able to do that. It's all extremely important, not just from a day one perspective, but also from a day two perspective. And once a container is packaged, what ends up happening is it then gets put into a container image registry. This is a critical component in the software lifecycle. And that's because this is where security has the ability to ensure that you've got validated, reproducible builds, that there are no CVEs in your applications, and you're not providing those vulnerabilities out to the wild. So this is, a great place where security can come, audit things, be able to identify what's going on there. But it's also serves as another function, which is the area where you get that repeatable infrastructure. You pull those containers from there and then deploy them onto Kubernetes. And then from a developer perspective, the developers are sitting there and they're developing code, but they also need those backend services. So as an IT operations and security team, I need to be able to provide a curated set of images that I know are secure, that I know are highly available, and that are according to my standards. And this is really where providing that catalog of services. And this is an area I see a lot of organizations get hung up on because they only want to provide a subset of services. Unfortunately, for the modern development era, that doesn't fly. Organizations need Postgres. They need a message queue as an example. They need a variety of services to be able to do the right tool for the right job. Going back to my retail example, from a cart functionality perspective, if I'm developing a cart function from a development perspective, I'll probably need a relational database. However, if I'm developing more of a search functionality, I'm probably going to need some kind of elastic search. So as a developer, I don't want to have to go and build those images, or do I have to want to wait for an architectural review board to go and sign off on my technologies? I expect IT operations to be able to provide me a curated set of images that I can consume as a developer. Now, once I've got my code, I've got that package, I've got my backend services, oftentimes this is where a CD takes over. And then this is where Kubernetes comes about. So now we're 4 steps into it, and ultimately what ends up happening is now the deployment occurs. And it goes on top of Kubernetes, and it's a consistent deployment because it's listed in a manifest from a container perspective. But what we've seen in a lot of organizations is they start off with these small Kubernetes projects here and there. And then what ends up happening is they need to build these fleets of clusters. And this is really where centralized management takes over. And it's important to be able to provide the flexibility for organizations and development teams to be able to spin up their own clusters, provision them, perform day 2 operations, but also ensure that security is in there by default. And this is really where that centralized management comes about. When Kubernetes first started, the industry often thought, hey, we'll just create one large cluster, very similar to like how you would in vSphere, you would create a large ESX cluster. But what they quickly came to find out that there's some security boundaries that, for example, may not be acceptable to the business. So the need for whether it be security boundaries to create new clusters, or it could be performance boundaries, an organization wanting to use GPUs. This is the need of organizations. And what we see is organizations having 20, 30, 40, 50 clusters. So once management's done, the organization needs to wire things together. You can't talk without a network, and this is really where service meshes have taken over. And service meshes are extremely critical for providing an additional layer of security to make sure that application A can talk to B, but maybe it can't talk to C. So critical from that perspective. It also provides things like mutual TLS and things of that nature. And then finally, observability. As an IT operations professional, this is table stakes. It's extremely important to provide observability. But in this new world, it's also extremely important to provide that from the hardware through to the application view. This reduces mean time to recovery in a lot of cases and reduces that friction and finger pointing that I was mentioning before. So this is the software development lifecycle that we talked about, and now it gets to the customer. So as you can see, there's a lot of components that make up this lifecycle and a lot of things to think about in terms of how do you integrate and select best of breed technologies. So I mentioned step one was optimizing your software release pipeline. The step two is really around microservices. And this is a methodology that ultimately allows development teams to provide independence of releasing, independent scale, to be able to choose your language that you would like to use for your particular application, to be able to use the backend service. Again, in my previous example, a cart functionality microservice using a relational database versus a search functionality, which is using Elasticsearch. This is breaking the seams and not having to deal with those monoliths, large coordination efforts. This really provides that speed to market that the business is seeking. Now, with microservice benefits comes the microservices realities. And from an IT professional perspective, you've got to support what development needs to be able to go fast for the business. And this is what it ends up looking like. And ultimately what it means is being able to use multiple clouds. So perhaps running a particular workload on vSphere and then utilizing a public cloud because you want to use machine learning as an example. So you're oftentimes going to be using a variety of clouds, and then you're going to have multiple Kubernetes clusters. You're going to be integrating in with legacy products through your virtual machines and things of that nature. So this is what the reality looks like. So the question then becomes is, if the software development lifecycle is step one and microservices is step two, is are you ready to be able to create those building blocks? So organizationally, from an application perspective, app developers need to get started quickly. They need to experiment. They need to be able to test. They need access to all of those things. So these are just some of the items that I talked about on previous slides as it relates to what does the application and developers need to be able to go fast, as well as infrastructure, being able to make sure that you can provide consistent experiences across clouds, to be able to provide consistent experiences across a fleet of Kubernetes clusters, ensure it's always up, and ensure it's always secure. Great. Those are the functions that you need to provide. Now you have to go build it. And this is where organizations get stuck. We see in a lot of cases where organizations will start with a small Kubernetes project. Great, they can get it off the ground running really quickly. But when it comes to operationalizing it, when it comes to securing it, when it comes to making sure it's flexible, it's an overwhelming task. It oftentimes causes analysis paralysis. This is why you see Kubernetes projects stalled in a lot of organizations, because this is a extremely complex problem to solve. And this is really where Tanzu can help simplify that and simplify the container lifecycle and Kubernetes altogether, ultimately helping you drive business outcomes. So if we go back to our previous slide here, what does the Tanzu portfolio provide? First and foremost, to provide the developers the ability to get started very quickly. We've got a project called App Accelerators. And ultimately what this enables a developer to do is to go into a catalog of services, look in that catalog and say, I want a Spring Boot application and I want a Postgres backend, but I don't want to have to write any Kubernetes manifests. How do I go about creating the auto wiring for that? And then the project spits out for me. So then I can just start hacking away at the code. That's really what App Accelerators provides, providing that curated app catalog. So tens and tens of services that you're going to have to provide to your developers. I had mentioned RabbitMQ, Postgres, there's MySQL, there's Elasticsearch, there's Cassandra, there's Mongo. There's a variety of tools that developers are going to want to consume. as a application developer, you need to have easy access to that, and you need to not be able to get bogged down by security boundaries and things of that nature. That's where Tanzu App Catalog provides. We provide a curated catalog of services that IT operations can provide their golden image, and we monitor the CVEs, we do all the integration testing, we integrate the best practices, and we provide it to organizations. And then secure consistent builds. And this is extremely critical because, as I mentioned, 12,000 CVEs last year alone. Build service provides not only the day one ability to build a container securely, but it also provides that day two operations to be able to hot swap out a container operating system or potentially a Java vulnerability as an example. So this is going to help organizations go fast forever. And then being able to provide this end to end, that's really our Tanzu app service. And then observability, getting deep into the metrics of the application, and also being able to correlate that through the infrastructure in Kubernetes as a whole. And then from an infrastructure perspective, and I'm just going to page through two of these real quick, is really focused on providing that consistent Kubernetes runtime. And we leverage something called Cluster API. And Cluster API is extremely powerful because what it does is it enables you as an organization to lay down consistent, clean, open source Kubernetes, whether it be on vSphere, whether it be on Azure, whether it be on Amazon as an example. So this eliminates a lot of the time and effort spent by IT operations to be able to adopt new clouds and integrate that software. Then around controlling your clusters, I spent a lot of time on this, and I think this is probably the most critical component here. It's very easy to get Kubernetes sprawl out there. So it's extremely important to be able to provide the day one provisioning, day two operations, and then the overall view into your clusters and role-based access control, and being able to lock down the security policies. I don't want a developer running a privileged container. How do I ensure that they get the flexibility in their Kubernetes to be able to deploy, but make sure that they're not doing something they shouldn't be doing? So that's a big component of that. Another big component of that is ensuring that you have the ability as an IT operations team to be able to back things up in a consistent fashion. And then finally, around Tanzu Service Mesh, this is really around wiring those applications together. So as you can see, in Tanzu's portfolio, we've integrated the best of breed technologies. We've taken the analysis paralysis out of that massive landscape in the CNCF community, and we provided these best of breed technologies to be able to optimize your security pipeline, thereby simplifying containers in Kubernetes. So what does this ultimately end up in? What it provides your developers is around 37% of productivity. This is a massive productivity gain. But not only does it provide productivity, it provides that speed to market. With productivity comes that speed to market, which ultimately is that unquantifiable benefit of being able to get an application in the hands of end users very quickly. And then from an infrastructure perspective, really being able to provide that operational efficiency with 78% to be able to make sure that you don't have fleets of teams going and having to build automation for deploying Kubernetes to, and all of the tools on top of it for the software development lifecycle on multiple clouds that your developers can make use of marketplaces or particular services. So circling back to the beginning and ultimately, how are we helping organizations simplify containers in Kubernetes? If you go back to those three personas that really support the business, it's really about helping the developers speed their deployment. It's about having them focus on writing code and not infrastructure, giving them the tool flexibility. From an IT operations perspective, it's about ensuring consistency. It's ensuring that you're always available. And then from a security perspective, you want to be able to secure the end-to-end lifecycle to ensure that your organization is always mitigating risks. Thanks, Will. Really appreciate the time here.
Awesome. Thank you, Nick. That was great. It looks like we have about a couple minutes left. If you don't mind, maybe I'll just ask you a couple of questions about things that we're seeing and, maybe some other things about Tanzu. So, it's interesting. I think this reminds me a lot of, back almost in the converged infrastructure days, right? Where customers originally, when a lot of this technology came to be, they had choice, right? They could go and they could get whatever server they wanted or storage array they wanted and network vendor they wanted. And, eventually it became a big lift to be able to have to engineer that and certify that and make sure, you've got compatibility with, drivers and firmware levels and all those other things. To me, this reminds me a lot of that, right? Where initially when Kubernetes came to be, there was a lot of choice, and there still is today. And a lot of it is rapidly available because it's open source and those types of things. But there's complexity there, and there's a cost associated with having to engineer that yourself. And to me, these packaged enterprise sort of production-ready curated solutions with the Tanzu portfolio just takes all the guesswork out of that, right? It takes it off our plate so that customers can focus on their differentiating code and bringing their services and applications to market, and IT can, just be simplified, right? That's the whole idea. So is that sort of the core of the value proposition with Tanzu? Does that?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely, it resonates.
Yeah.
I think when I go and talk to a lot of organizations, what ends up happening is they say, oh yeah, we can spin up Kubernetes. But it's really that hidden cost around how do I get the platform out the door? And as I mentioned before, it's such a vast ecosystem, and it oftentimes causes analysis paralysis. There's so many great technologies out there. So why not rely on a vendor to create the best of breed technologies, pull in the best of open source, and to be able to wire it together, integrate it, and ensure that I don't have to sit there and audit CVE databases and make sure that I then have to go through that whole cycle again of integration and testing and things of that nature. So I love the parallel. It's very similar from that perspective.
Yeah, it's. I mean, we're seeing so much interest now, and even those early adopters, right, that went out and did it themselves. They bootstrapped their Kubernetes project. Maybe they had one or two, or maybe a handful of applications that they were modernizing, or maybe they were greenfield. And but now they're sort of circling the wagons, and they're coming back and they're saying, well, wait a second, at scale, this is really, really hard, right? And I need technology like this to make that scaling this to tens and hundreds of applications a lot easier for me, right? So that's definitely what we're seeing. Can you talk a little bit about the Tanzu portfolio? It's matured a lot, right, in the last couple of years, and I think early on there was maybe some conversations around how when it first came out, you needed to have VCF, right? And there's obviously a ton of value with packaging it with VCF. But I think, not a lot of people know that, some of those, it was perceived to be a big lift to put this technology in, right?
Absolutely.
Talk to me about how that's changed a little bit, like it's the decoupling of NSX and some of the other things that are going on there, just for people who aren't aware.
Yeah, definitely. So I think one of the core tenets of Tanzu is flexibility. So we got to get started somewhere. So we wanted to make sure that we were running on a fully integrated stack. But as I mentioned before, there's tons and tons of technologies out there that we want to make sure that they're hot swappable. So while we still feel and we believe that running on top of VCF is the best possible experience, we also provide the flexibility to choose to run it on just native vSphere and without NSX as an example. There are significant benefits to integrating those, but ultimately we want to drive that flexibility to make sure that we're meeting our customers where they are.
That's great. And I think, for me, right, as a partner, and I can say this, I think being able to get this into customers' environments, maybe in the simplest form, right? Just vSphere with Tanzu, right? Maybe not with NSX day one. It allows them to sort of experience and consume the technology. And then there are opportunities to layer in, NSX or eventually maybe the full, VCF stack, which again, there's a tremendous amount of value in doing that. I agree. But I think it's important for customers to know who maybe aren't aware of some of those actually pretty recent changes. Last question. So, if let's say there's a customer out there who saw this presentation, they're interested. What's the best way for them? Like, what is the best next step? How do they learn more? What do they do? Who do they talk to? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'd say the first step is to reach out to your CDI or VMware rep. And then from there, depending on if they're an application developer, perhaps maybe the next best step is to do an application discovery session. Or we could do a deeper dive or demo on the Tanzu portfolio. If your IT operations or security, maybe it's more of a value stream analysis or doing a deeper dive analysis on what their DevSecOps pipeline looks like right now, to talk about how they can, how we can ultimately help solve their challenges. And then there's always the option of a pilot. And I would really welcome folks to reach out to CDI. CDI is an authorized service provider with VMware. They've got their master services competency. So we work very closely with CDI and my friend here, Will, and looking forward to working with everybody.
Awesome. Well, Nick, hey, thanks so much for joining us at the Tech Summit. To the customers who are watching, thank you so much for joining us as well. We hope you're getting a lot of value and enjoyment out of our conference this year, and we hope to engage with you soon. So thank you very much, and we'll see you all very soon. Take care.
Thanks, everybody.